o'clock on the dot. And so welcome everyone to today's amazing webinar where we're going to talk about uncovering and discovering and demystifying all of the revenue operations questions. So the name of the game is what sales and marketing leaders should know about RevOps. We've got joining us today Hayes Davis and Jenn Davis from oh so sunny Austin, Texas. Love it, the questions. So whether you're watching in person or on demand, shoot us what you're thinking so we can help you through. We do this webinar series so that you're not muddling on your own. This is something so that you can get better at your jobs. And with that, I am going to get off screen and put it into the capable hands of Hayes and Jenn, who, if you don't mind giving us a little bit of who you are and why we've brought you here, and then take the reins away, my friends.
That sounds great. Well, why don't you start?
Sure. I'm Hayes Davis, co-founder and CEO of Gradient.works. I've been doing RevOps for a while now. My most recent role before this startup was as SVP of Revenue Operations at a company called Cision. I had a large team supporting about 600 sellers globally. So I learned a ton from that, and hopefully I can share some of that today.
And I'm Jenn Davis, the other co-founder of Gradient.works and head of marketing. And my career has been more on the marketing side of the go-to-market organization. And before starting Gradient.works with Hayes, I was also at Cision, and my job there was global head of communications, content, and brand. And so there I worked kind of top of the funnel and saw a lot of very interesting things that we'll be talking about today as it comes to the role of marketing in RevOps. And so, yeah, let's plug this in and get this thing going.
Sure. And I think, one other thing that I will add as we're sharing the screen here is, one of the things that we do at Gradient.works is we help our customers understand how to manage responsibility and handoffs across the customer lifecycle. And as part of that, we have spent a ton of time talking to CROs, sales leaders, ops leaders. We spend a lot of time helping them look at their processes, understand how they are organizing their handoffs, and whether that's all the way from marketing through to customer success. So it's kind of a unique perspective, I think, that we bring to thinking about RevOps, because a lot of what the reason RevOps exists in the first place is about bringing those pieces together. So I think that's a good place to start.
And so before we dive in, I just want to make sure that you guys can see our presentation. So if somebody can say something in the chat, either yes or no, or let us know, make sure that this is actually working. It looks like it should be. Okay, awesome. Right. Thank you. All right.
Thank you.
Well, and also thank you all for being here. We're excited to have this conversation. So yeah, let's get started. We thought we would start today by providing a little foundation on, so that we're all speaking from the same framework. What is RevOps? What does it mean? Why are we here? How did we get to this stage with, RevOps becoming more and more prominent in a lot more organizations? And then we've got some questions we're going to sort of talk through between each other, between ourselves, and then have time for audience questions as well. So hopefully we'll get to a lot of the things that you're thinking about, but if not, we'll make sure we leave time at the end to answer any of those questions. So what is RevOps?
Sure. So I think one of the things that, and we'll talk a little bit maybe about some of the ways that people, misidentify RevOps or sort of have some different thoughts about what it means. RevOps isn't really just purely about technology. RevOps is not just having a good Salesforce team or a good HubSpot team or whatever that is. RevOps is really about trying to recognize that our companies are here to serve a customer, and that customer has a journey that goes all the way from how they engage with your marketing and how they become aware of you, all the way through to a sales process. And ultimately, for many companies, you focus on customer retention, right? Whether that's bringing a customer back to purchase again, or if you're in a SaaS type environment, it's ensuring that a customer renews, right? And so across the board there, as that customer lifecycle is increasingly complex, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, you really have to be thinking about how do you bring together not just the technology, but the people and the processes that underlie all of those go-to-market functions for that entire customer lifecycle. And so RevOps is really all about that. It's about bringing all of those pieces together so that you can ultimately provide a fantastic customer experience, but also serve the needs of your internal stakeholders for data, for efficient go-to-market processes, and ultimately being able to to meet your goals as a company. So it's really about bringing all of those things together from an operational and execution standpoint.
Yep, exactly. And we're going to use a lot of vocabulary probably as we go through this, many of which I'm sure most of you will recognize. But if we ever say something that you're not familiar with, or if you want to share some of this vocabulary with your teams, one of the things we've prepared, not just for this webinar, but in general as a resource for our customers, is a RevOps glossary that goes through a lot of these concepts and terms with a bunch of definitions, as well as additional resources on some of these, things like everything from account-based marketing to a lot of the more technical things that we'll be talking about. And so there's a link to it here. We'll make sure that you get that as well, but it's on Gradient.works. And it's a really useful resource as we go through some of this, how do you implement it? What sorts of resources do you need? And what do you need to be thinking about in your organization? So we'll come back to some of those things as we go.
Sure. If you ever find yourself lost in ABM, SQL, MQL, SAO, NRR, NDR kind of land, hopefully it'll be helpful for you. So, why are we talking about RevOps all the time right now? And I touched on a few of those things earlier, but, I think it's fair to say, like the slide says, that revenue orgs are changing, but revenue orgs are changing really because customer behaviors are changing. I'm kind of making the assumption here, and certainly talking from the perspective of B2B sales organizations. And so that's kind of the lens that we're using. Some of these changes are applicable in more B2C type situations as well. But if you think about the way in which we've sold, whether it's software or anything else in a B2B context over the past 10 or 20 years, there's been some big shifts. One of those shifts has been very urgent in the past little bit, which has been, we used to have this really big debate about field sales. Do you have people in market? Are they going to be there talking to your customers and going to visit, versus inside sales? Are we going to try to have all of our conversations with our customers and prospects remotely, right? And so COVID has forced us to really focus in many ways on an inside sales only process. And, if we had had this conversation maybe a month or two ago, we might have said, hey, that's loosening up a little bit, right? And we're thinking about putting people in the field again. But, here we are. And I think there's still a lot of concern about really our ability going forward to have people in the field, and also to have people, even in an inside sales motion, in the same room, right? And so a lot of things that used to be easy or easier about trying to keep people on the same page and have people follow process, and even just get people pumped up, right? You don't have as many shortcuts as you used to, because you can't just walk around the floor and look over people's shoulders. And so having a strong operational mindset allows you to ensure that people are able to work successfully from anywhere. And that's a really big motivator, I think, for why people are really thinking about investing in revenue operations. The other thing, especially from a B2B context, that's really important is that traditional funnels, the way that we've all seen the drawing, right? Our customers come in at the top, prospects come in at the top, and customers come out the bottom, right? And I think we've all known that that's been a little bit BS for a while now, but I think that this process doesn't really look much like that anymore. B2B customers, B2B prospects are buying a lot more like consumers, but they're also buying as teams. And so you have to really understand, how do you build a customer lifecycle and an approach to engaging a customer where maybe you have a few different people from one team who might poke around your website and look for some self-service information before maybe one person reaches out and asks you a question, and then maybe they go away and deliberate for a while and then they come back. And so how do you actually understand the ways in which you measure a funnel like that, that's not really a funnel, that's nonlinear in that way? And I think that this idea that we can just assume that a customer is going to do exactly what we want and go from stage to stage to stage, and we can just think about measuring the conversion rates at each one of those stages, and voila, we've got a perfect model. That's just gone. It's never been completely true, and now it's just completely false, and you're misleading yourself if you're focused on that. And then I think this one is a little bit, this is something we think about a lot. We like to think in a very systems way about how revenue organizations work. I mentioned people, process, and technology before. And what I think is super cool about revenue organizations is that it is a combination of all of those things. I used to be a software engineer, and I used to build, distributed systems where you want to have computers that talk to each other to get things done. And in a lot of ways, a revenue organization works a lot like that, but now at every stage, you've got humans, and you have human interactions that need to happen and are critical to the process, both internal and external human interactions. And then you have processes that you need to try to make sure that the system is operating well as a whole. And then you have the technology that often underpins lots and lots of those interactions and those processes themselves. And so if you don't take a full systemic view of how all those pieces work together, and then also don't take a systemic view of the customer experience and the customer lifecycle across marketing, sales, and acquisition, and then retention, you're not going to be able to really understand the levers that you have to drive your business forward. And RevOps puts you in a place where you're pulling all of those things together so that you can move more quickly. And I think in the end, this is what I was alluding to here, which is that, one of the reasons that a lot of revenue organizations of all sizes are struggling to adapt to these changes is that all of the important stuff in this world that you have to be addressing as these changes kind of come upon us live at the intersection of people, process, and technology. So I always like to think of it as this Venn diagram, and all the cool stuff happens in the overlaps, right? And your actual outcomes are in the overlap of all three, kind of in the center. And so, when you think about people and process working together, if you have a large organization already, I'm sure that it comes as no surprise that people get into silos, and you have different teams that are operating in different ways. And then when those teams need to meet other teams, you have all these kind of process conflicts. And that can be a huge challenge to manage through, right? And having a clearinghouse like RevOps can be to help you figure out how to align those processes and those teams is super important. And then, of course, on the technology and people interaction side, I always like to say technology is dumb, right? Sure, we talk about it like it's this thing that's, we're going to get this piece of software and it's going to save us from X, Y, and Z. It's not really what happens. Technology is something you use to execute your processes and help people do their jobs, right? And increasingly, I don't know if you all are seeing this in your roles or not, but increasingly, sales reps or folks on the marketing team across the spectrum here are dealing with many different tools across the board. I've seen numbers as high as 12 that a sales rep might need to use on a daily basis. I've also seen investment levels in a typical, reasonably scaled sales organization. You're probably investing $500, $600 a month in SaaS products that your sales organization and your reps are using. A lot of times that goes to CRM, some of it, but then a lot of it sits on top of that. But I've seen numbers as high as 1,000. So you're making all these investments in technology to enable your people to do things. Do you have a real understanding of how that's plugging into your goals and what you're trying to achieve? And then lastly is how technology and process interact, right? People need to execute process through technology, and RevOps is really all about helping to enable that. And if you're not able to do those things, you can't really manage these things as you scale. We all know when you're starting out and you're developing a bigger team and you're developing some sophistication around your operational capabilities, you can kind of fudge a lot of these things, right? You got a small team that's really working together, but this becomes increasingly important as your team scales and as you get increasing specialization across that customer lifecycle, because then you need some part of your organization to be looking holistically across that. And that's where RevOps comes in.
That's great. So this is the background, the foundation that helps us understand both what is RevOps, where are we coming from, and why does RevOps even exist? And so we're going to spend the next 15 or 20 minutes talking through some more of the details about, okay, so how, and who, and some of those. And this will be, we've got some questions we know we're going to go ahead and answer, but if you have other questions, again, feel free to type them in and we'll answer them. So, one of the first things that we always who needs RevOps, and when do you start to implement RevOps in your organization? A lot of the examples you hear about, they're larger software companies with, high growth, and clearly those companies need RevOps, but so do a lot of other businesses. And so one of the things that's really important is to talk about, so when do you think about this? Who should be thinking about this? One of the things we say is you should already have the best time to start a RevOps organization was 6 months ago. The next best time is now.
Sure.
But just like everything else, but who would you say needs a RevOps organization?
Well, and let's be clear. I think, we've talked about RevOps here as spanning, again, that customer life cycle, which RevOps really came about, I think, as starting to think about how do I bring marketing ops, sales ops, and customer success ops all together, again, based on that recognition of we have to create this experience and this efficient approach across the customer journey. I think the answer to who needs RevOps is you need some amount of operational support if you're selling anything. And that's a little bit of a pithy answer, and I promise I'm not going to answer all of these questions with, well, it depends, right? I think the answer is you're probably already doing part of RevOps now. I would imagine a lot of folks on this, on this call listening in, they have maybe a sales ops person, or they have some folks who are thinking through the operational aspects of how they get the job done. And certainly a lot of sales leadership does things that RevOps teams might be applied to from an operational standpoint. We've talked a lot about technology, right? And what I want to stress here is that, the answer of when you need RevOps isn't when you've got a marketing automation platform and a CRM and you want to connect those two together. That's not really the answer. The answer is that when you need to operationalize some kind of a strategy, then that's when you want to think about how do we actually achieve that in our organization, and is it complex enough across a number of parts of the customer lifecycle that we might want to pull that together into part of the organization. And when I say that, think about it this way. We've got, in any organization, you start thinking about who's your ideal customer profile, what are the market segments you're targeting within your total addressable market, all of those kinds of things. And then ultimately you start thinking about, how do I divide that work up? Maybe it's going to be geographic territories. Maybe I'm going to have people focus on verticals. Maybe I'm going to have just open territories, and I'm going to allocate out account books to my reps or something like that, right? Those questions impact everything that you do, from marketing, sales, and retention. And RevOps is depending on how you structure things, RevOps is usually central to that conversation alongside finance. Many organizations have a finance team that does a lot of the work around market segmentation, or who is going, what are the book sizes for different reps, that sort of thing. And sometimes that falls to FP&A, but sometimes that can be very, very disassociated with actually implementing those kinds of plans and those approaches. And so I think RevOps brings to the table an ability to analyze the data with intent to operationalize the processes around that data. And I think that if you find yourself as a sales leader or as a revenue leader spending a lot of time on that kind of analysis and then struggling to operationalize that into an actual plan that your team can go execute, that's when you should start thinking about RevOps as a partner in that process. And it could be that they're more focused around the analysis, right? And they're doing that, and it's less about like, oh, they're a Salesforce admin or they're a HubSpot admin or something like that, right? So it's something you should be considering across the board, but it's also not necessarily something where if you don't have a named head of RevOps that you're falling behind, right? You need to think about it in the context of, do I have folks who can help me pull all these pieces together? And would those folks be better off if they were collected together into a single organization? And that's when RevOps starts to coalesce.
That's great. So then next, what do we have next? So what do you need? We know one of the things everybody wants to know about is, how do you implement this? What are the resources you need? What are the first steps or the second steps, or the kinds of things that you need to be thinking about practically, right? Everybody gets probably why you should want RevOps. So how do you actually do it? Which is a huge question and a webinar completely unto itself, many webinars. A career's worth of webinars, but what are some of the things that you need to be thinking about practically?
Sure. So I think a lot of RevOps to me, or a lot of, if you're spinning up any organization in your company, right, you're going to start thinking a lot about roles and team before you think about anything else. And if there's one thing to take away from this conversation, I want to stress that, again, RevOps isn't just like running your tech stack, right? And so I think one of the things you want to do is start thinking about, how do I put somebody in a place in my organization who can start to bring these things together, right? And so I was actually having a conversation this morning with someone who's in a senior operations role, and we're talking about where she reports into the organization, right? And so historically, I think in a lot of cases, when we've had maybe an isolated sales ops function, sales ops would report into the sales leadership of the organization, right? Marketing ops is going to report into the marketing leadership, et cetera. One of the things you should ask yourself is, if you're an organization, for example, with a COO, or you have an operational kind of a business ops part of your organization, would it make more sense to have this team report into that part of the organization versus reporting directly into sales? So I think, first of all, think about where these roles might fit. And one of the big challenges with RevOps, when you're thinking of who would be responsible for it, is it is inherently cross-functional, right? We've been talking about that implicitly this entire time, but RevOps is something where you are going to have to work with marketing leadership and new business leadership and retention leadership and probably legal and probably finance and probably accounting, right? And so one of the things you really want to be thinking about, again, narrowing this down to, who do we hire, or how do we get this started? You want somebody who is going to be equipped to manage stakeholders within the organization. And that does vary based on your organization. If you're 10 people, managing stakeholders within the organization might be sitting out a Slack and say, hey, I want to do this thing. Is everybody cool with it? And everybody says, thumbs up, right? If you're, 5,000 people, right, you're going to have these like well-defined little, parts of each organization that then it becomes a full-time job essentially to just manage stakeholders and who wants what, when, and how you prioritize all of those things. And so I think a very underrated component of hiring for sales ops or for RevOps is somebody who can really deal with stakeholders, manage stakeholder expectations, communicate very, very clearly, because a lot of this role and success in this role is going to be doing that. And so I would say, when you're thinking about implementing RevOps, I think what you need is you need a role, a person you can put in place who can start to look at that holistically. The other thing is, if you're going to put somebody in this role where they're thinking through all of these multiple stakeholder type issues, you got to have buy-in from the rest of your organization, right? So if you, if there's a CEO on this call and you've got a VP of marketing, VP of sales, VP of customer success, right? And you say, okay, and then you got a CFO. You say, okay, I want to put in RevOps, right? Well, if the CFO, let's say, is dead set against having anyone else involved in anything that vaguely resembles FP&A analysis or something like that, this is going to be a huge struggle, right? So what you need to do at the very top level is make sure that you've got buy-in from everybody who's going to be, all the leaders who are going to be working with this team, because what this team is doing ultimately is providing a platform for those leaders to succeed and execute. And if those leaders want to keep those pieces to themselves, or they're not willing to say, take a larger view of how their particular set of needs impact the rest of the organization and understand that their requests might get deprioritized for some bigger priority. If you don't quite have that in place, you're going to be setting somebody up to fail, and your RevOps organization is going to struggle to get off the ground. And so, I think that's a place where you need to really start thinking about how do I get somebody in that kind of a role, right? And then, from there, I think we're going to talk a little bit later, a little bit more about team construction, maybe some things like that. But I think you want to start to think about building around that person. But, it isn't like you need a specific technology or something like that. It's really more about you have this need that you want to build a team around, right? Yeah.
Well, let's talk about the team then. Let me just scoop this question up.
I need to.
Oh, I got to refresh. Oh, I can't do it on the fly. I'm sorry.
Yeah, there we go.
Okay, so since we're going to talk about this anyway, let's move it up. So you mentioned when you're starting, or as soon as possible, you need someone who can manage stakeholders, which is probably true of a lot of main hires in most every team, but it's something that is core to what RevOps is. So what else? I know that a lot of times we think about that first RevOps hire, or this is true for sales op and marketing ops too, is that person has to do everything, right? We're looking for these magical unicorns who can do literally everything, from the tech side of things and the Salesforce administration to the data and the analytics to the presenting in meetings and managing the CFO and all of that. But we know that's not realistic. Right. So what sorts of things do you need on the RevOps team, and how do you kind of get around the unicorn issue?
Yeah, you have to, I would say first, you've got to, in that initial hire that I was talking about, you've got to resist the unicornification of that. So I almost got a spit take out of that.
Just about. Wasn't quite funny enough.
So, you've got to start thinking about what are our focus, how do we want to focus that role? And, I've seen, I talked to a number of folks who are maybe making their first RevOps hire, or, they're making their second RevOps hire, which is also an interesting question we'll get to in a second. And too often I've seen, like, oh, they must be able to administer Salesforce. They must be able to work with stakeholders. They must be able to, have executive presence and communicate, really good at communicating. They must be able to do business intelligence. Like the list just gets bigger and bigger, right? And you're just not going to find somebody who's able to do all of those things. So I think the right kernel to build around usually is somebody who has a decent amount of technical capabilities just for managing the products that you're dealing with, usually in the tech stack, but also for being able, again, to work with stakeholders and help to prioritize that. I would say from there, well, the reality is most of the time that's not who people have. And that's not who people hire, right? Usually what happens is I say usually, but I've seen this quite a bit. You've got a pretty gifted admin that you hired for, your CRM or something like that, and you say, hey, you could do more, why don't we make you sales ops? And then, okay, well, you could do more, why don't we make you RevOps, right? And so I think that that can work with the right person for sure, but people do tend to get a little bit out of their depth usually at some point there. Thinking to me about the construction of the ideal team, I would say there's probably 3 key roles. Number one is that leader who knows how to operate within the organization, drive alignment, that kind of thing. Then they will need to have someone who is focused on the technical execution. So there's usually a role, whether that's a HubSpot admin or Salesforce admin or whatever, that is a little bit more technically oriented, that can, usually work with your CRM and then usually work with the other sort of ecosystem of products that usually connect into that CRM. And then I would also say you typically need an analyst type role who is going to be more well-equipped to deal with any kind of data analysis that you might want to do for things like customer segmentation, territory, divisions, that type of thing. And then, also able to deal with, they may be responsible for commissions, calculations. There's some, good software that can simplify those things, those kinds of things. So typically there's sort of that analyst role, that more technical role, and then you need that leader role who's helping to prioritize and contextualize all the work these folks are doing to align them with the rest of the business. That sort of forms the core. As you get bigger, those things break out into more specialization. So maybe you have folks who are responsible for administering the marketing automation piece versus the CRM piece versus, X, Y, and Z. You can get big enough where you need that kind of technical capability. And I'll just pause for a second and say sometimes in some organizations that stuff lives in IT, and IT really wants to maintain a hold on that. That can work. It just creates yet another stakeholder relationship that you've got to manage. On the analyst side, that tends to involve additional specialization. I mean, you can get to a place where you've got, commissions analysts, and you've got analysts who are, really, really focused on like TAM and territories and things like that. And then that can shade into more of an FP&A type role as well, depending on how that works. So, but I think those are sort of the core ones. Where I see this, go wrong or is a challenge for people is often that analyst role will end up as like if you're not careful and you don't have the right leader, it can end up as sort of a gopher for the sales team, right? Or something like that. Oh, I've got this, CPQ problem and I want to enter this order. Could you just do that real quick? That kind of thing, and so you end up suddenly with this sort of this person who isn't really doing anything much strategic. They're just sort of there for any kind of tactical data pulls and requests or the other flip side of it is that some of the sales leaders who are on this call, you may be constantly just asking that person to pull you a report. Right. And so you may be the time vampire in that case that isn't allowing them to do something strategic. So you got to be careful with that role, that you scope it and that you keep it focused on doing something that has strategic value.
I think a related part of this is not just who you're hiring and their skills and experience, but what areas typically fall under RevOps. And I know that varies a lot. For example, sales enablement is sometimes a RevOps function, sometimes not. So do you have a recommended structure? What has worked? What doesn't work? Have you seen anything like that that could be helpful?
I think, in my previous role, sales enablement did fall into our team.
We should technically call it revenue enablement, I would think,
yes,
at that point, because we're enabling more than just sales.
And that can work, but it can be a bit of a stretch, right? And so again, if it's not part of RevOps, it becomes another stakeholder, right? But what I will say is that that's actually a really good point about enablement, because I think that should be a top level part of this conversation. Going back to this idea of a revenue system comprising people, process, and technology, what is super important is that if you're rolling out process changes or you're making technology changes that impact the people, enablement has to be a top level concern, right? And that often gets lost in RevOps type conversations because we're so focused on talking about, well, we're going to do this new process, right? Or we're going to implement, this new sales engagement, tool or something like that. And like, oh, wait, we got to train the sales team, right? And then it becomes we roll this thing out and we do like a brown bag lunch on a Friday and like get people to, buy people some pizza and then talk about it for a minute. You can't do that, right? And that's where that's where any initiative that you do goes to die because you basically have to think about from the very beginning, how do we ensure that the people who are going to be impacted by these changes understand the context of these changes, are able to execute effectively once these changes are live, and then how are we going to support them after those changes if there are questions or issues or anything like that. And so the projects I've seen go well treat that as a core part of the project. The things that I've seen go poorly treat it as an afterthought. And so whether or not that technically falls under RevOps in your organization, there's arguments, I think, either way. If it doesn't, you better make damn sure that your RevOps folks work really well with that team and don't discount the importance of enablement within all of this.
So enablement, maybe yes or no. What else falls under RevOps? You mentioned BI.
Sure.
So do you think business intelligence is typically a RevOps function or not? I know it was for you, but it isn't always.
I think so. That's probably another a proper structure for a BI organization where that should fit in your organization is a whole other, probably a whole other set of webinars. But it can, the other home for it a lot of times is in a finance organization, sometimes maybe in just like a bit, sometimes in IT as well. I think it depends a little bit on how you're focusing, what the focus of your BI activities are, right? If it's really about understanding operationally how your sales process is executing, understanding, what your conversion rates are at different stages of the, fictional funnel, right? If it's really operationally related to your sales organization, then great, having that associated with RevOps is good. If you're really trying to have a business intelligence discipline across your entire organization where there's a single place people go for, everything from like current headcount to, recognized revenue this month or whatever, that shouldn't live in RevOps because it's not, the scope is too broad.
Yeah. Anything else that should or shouldn't, like things that you've seen?
I think one of the interesting, nuances with RevOps is how it integrates with the marketing side of the business. Depending on some organizations, there's a really significant operational challenge in marketing for maybe your customer facing website or your webinars that you run or whatever that might be, right? And so some of those things can be very specialized into a particular part of the organization. And so it's important to think carefully about, am I helping to enable like this full customer life cycle? And are we getting some economies of scale by having a team that are looking at all of those things versus, oh, that seems opsy, let's throw it in RevOps, right? So it's not an easy line. And I think you can draw the line in a lot of different places, but it can be tempting to just throw anything that vaguely resembles like an operational motion into RevOps. And I think it's just important to think carefully about whether that gives you, again, that economies of scale. Are you actually getting things that you can reuse and capabilities that you can reuse and better interconnections across processes by putting those things together.
A lot of this is about where you draw the different lines, right? That's ultimately kind of what RevOps is to have fewer lines, but still you have to draw some, because what is RevOps and what isn't. And so,
Sure.
well, so speaking of that, yeah, this next one, I love these questions. What are things that people get wrong about revenue operations? I want to hear like horror stories now, but and you don't have to name names, but you can. No, but what are some things that, you know, typically we get wrong when we're talking about this?
I will keep beating this particular horse, I suppose, here, that it's not just technology, right? I think that a lot of the time that is where people think about, oh, I'm spending, $100,000 on SaaS products a year for my sales team. Well, I better get RevOps, right? And those folks will just those folks are going to be responsible for administering that, right? So RevOps isn't just about sort of administering your tech stack, right? And I think that's something that people often will get wrong about RevOps. The other thing is, I know that RevOps is kind of emerged from high growth technology, like usually software, usually SaaS companies, right? And I think that so there's maybe a little bit of a mindset that those are the only kinds of companies that need RevOps. And I think that mindset isn't necessarily accurate. I think that the way to think about it, going back to a lot of the points we touched on, is is there an entire relationship across the customer lifecycle that you need to foster? Is there some complexity in your sales process? Is the sales process fairly fast moving, right? Where it's it is a challenge to ensure all the parts are moving correctly. And I think the reason that RevOps emerged out of that context was, one, high growth organizations are dealing with a lot of change, right? And as you start to scale out those organizations, managing rapid change where different parts of the customer lifecycle, marketing, sales, customer success were getting siloed was becoming really untenable. The other thing I think is really important is that it emerged out of the software and SaaS in particular part of the world, because you're building customer relationships that are inherently non-transactional, right? You have an addressable market that you need to work with, and then you need to, once you acquire those customers, and often you pay a ridiculous amount to acquire those customers on the assumption you can then retain them for a long period of time. You need to operationally enable that. And I think that's where pulling all these pieces together became a big part of it. So I think, I think that's something else that people get wrong, is that, well, this is for software companies or this is for tech companies. I think if you are an organization where you have a reasonably high velocity of sales, you have customers that you want to either come back or that you want to retain, and that you do have somewhat of a tech-enabled sales process, then RevOps is something you should consider. If you have 5 sales reps and a total addressable market of 100 companies, and you're selling $1 million deals, like, do you need to have a fully functioning big RevOps organization to drive that type of business? No, I don't think so. Right. Mm-hmm. So I think that's one of the things, but there's more nuance to it than just, oh, we don't sell software, so we don't need RevOps.
Another thing I've heard you talk about before is hiring too small a team, assuming that you just get one RevOps person and they can kind of do it. And that can lead to burnout and all kinds of things. Sure. I don't know if you have anything else to add to that, but I know that's something I've heard you talk about.
I mean, I think usually that happens a lot of times in the, oh, we want to call what we're doing RevOps, and so we're going to take the Salesforce admin and we're going to call them like our director of RevOps or something, right? And then they're going to have people, suddenly, instead of just dealing with Salesforce or something like that, they now have like all these different people asking them for all these different things. And they don't really have the capacity to manage that. So I think the idea that you can just kind of, sort of name someone your head of RevOps without doing all the stuff we talked about before about stakeholder alignment and, being able to work cross-functionally is something that you're really not going to be able to do very well. That said, I've never met a person in a RevOps organization who said, man, we just have so many people and we just don't have enough to do, right? That doesn't exist, right? And so you've got to, I do think you need some of those three types that I described, but you also don't necessarily need to hire a giant team either. You can build it up as you go, but your expectations about what that team can achieve need to be commensurate with the resources that you are providing to that team.
So the last question that we have on our slides, and then we can hand it over for audience questions, is kind of a future thinking. And I don't know if you saw this one or not, so I don't know if you prepared anything. But what are some of the trends that you see in the organizations that seem to be kind of ahead of the trend, ahead of the curve when it comes to RevOps and related sorts of things? What trends?
I think increasingly I'm seeing RevOps organizations start to look at other disciplines, other operationally oriented disciplines in the rest of the world, and start to try to adopt some things from them. So I mentioned earlier that I used to be a software engineer, and there are a lot of practices that have evolved over the last 10 years or so in the world of developer operations, DevOps, where people are starting to think very differently about how they apply technology to building out systems. Things like, how can we have technology to do what we want, on demand? Or how do we think about orchestrating, this resource and pulling those things together and automating more and more of those kinds of processes? And I think in forward-looking, future-looking revenue orgs, I think they're starting to think more like those types of DevOps organizations and say, okay, how can we have access to resources on demand? How can we think about this as a holistic system? It's not just the CRM and then the marketing automation platform and X, Y, and Z, but how do we think about bringing this entire system together and start to make it easier to change the system, measure the system. Those types of things are super important. I compared it to DevOps, which is a much more a newer phenomenon, but I think I'm starting to see revenue orgs start to take some cues from manufacturing organizations in the 70s and 80s, when there was this idea of how do we get to more of a lean manufacturing approach, where we're starting to think about where are my bottlenecks in my organization? How can I ensure that I have the resources I need and exactly the point in time that I need them? And how do I think about the ways in which I can use technology to make different parts of the entire system more efficient? And so I think that I'm starting to see RevOps organizations, revenue organizations really think about these things systemically, get rid of these types of silos in terms of how they think about, well, I've got this marketing team and they just give me leads, and this BDR team and they just qualify things, but really starting to think about the downstream and upstream implications of different parts of how the organization fits together. And then ultimately, how does that increase the output of the overall system? And so I think it's seeing that systems thinking. I think we're applying additional automation wherever we can to different parts of the revenue organization. And then I think that we're trying to really integrate all of that together. And I think that I'm seeing organizations try to, as they're thinking about these things, look outside maybe the history of like sales organizations have always operated this way. We've always done geographic territories, right? They're starting to think about, well, in a world where everything is inside sales, and we're selling like just a horizontally, applicable SaaS product, should we have a rep that's focused on New York and a rep that's focused on Idaho, right? Does that make any sense? And so, those are the types of questions that I think folks are starting to ask, is how do we fit these systems together in a way that optimizes for what we're doing, and not just because we've always done it in a particular way.
Mm-hmm. I think that's great. Well, it's a good place for us to pause and hand it back over to you, Lindsay, if you have other questions you'd like for us to answer.
Yeah, I think a couple of the ones that had come in from our audience, we really loved the trends, and especially, the teams, because trends and teams are always the places, but thinking about it from just a practical application, think about the tools for me for a second. We have a lot of these conversations that are happening with our HubSpot clients, with our Salesforce clients. Marketo and Oracle are tiptoeing up to it. What are the tools that you're seeing be most successful, and where is it where, as we like to say here in Texas, you're seeing that duct tape and baling wire approach where, the ecosystem's still kind of catching up with the reality. And this is what marketers, sales ops, and customer experience are trying to put together as we get to the next phase of this new world.
Well, I would say most RevOps organizations I've spent any time with become really good duct tapers and baling wire deployers, because there's still quite a lot of that. I think from a tools perspective, whether we like it or not, most of the time, the CRM, whatever we choose for the CRM, is going to be the core of how we do things. And so I talk about the revenue tech stack. Sitting at the bottom layer of the revenue tech stack is usually your choice of CRM, right? And then you start layering things on top of that. And so I think one of the interesting developments there is the CRM is almost always paired with a marketing automation platform, right? And so that is, that can be HubSpot, that can be Marketo, Eloqua, Pardot, there's a set of additional ones that you might put in there. We're seeing some forward-looking products we're seeing both Salesforce and HubSpot attempt to own and put together both the CRM and the marketing automation platform into a single unit. And one of the reasons for that is, too often, and I see this all the time, especially in the part of our business where we deal with things like lead routing and stuff like that, is getting those two pieces to work together effectively is still a challenge, even when you're dealing with Pardot, which is a Salesforce product, and Salesforce, right? And so I think there's an area where I think that relationship is maybe starting to blur a little bit. And certainly there's a lot of vendors who want it to blur because they see opportunities for expanding their, customer seat base. So we're seeing that. I think increasingly, that for the types of organizations that I often work with, more again, tech and SaaS oriented organizations, I think it's become standard to have sales engagement software, a Sales Loft or an Outreach, something like that. Those are increasingly taking on, CRM-ish type elements as well, and marketing automation elements, right? And so but basically, if you have any kind of an outbound function, you're gonna have one of those. And then there's things that I would lump under, every vendor wants to expand out what they do to some sort of big concept, right? But then there's more things that are like conversational intelligence type things, understanding and assisting with the things, the demos that your reps run, the conversations that your reps run every single day, things like Gong, for example, Chorus, which recently was acquired, I believe, by ZoomInfo. You see that type of product. There's also, and this is very important from a RevOps standpoint, there's a whole ecosystem of data enrichment kind of products. Usually when you're dealing with things like market segmentation or think about your TAM, you got to understand whether this, this particular account that you have in your CRM, do we think they have $100 million in revenue or $1 in revenue, right? Are they in this vertical or that vertical? And so, there's a number of tools like Clearbit, ZoomInfo, things like that can help you with the data enrichment side of things. They can often be surprisingly expensive, but they're often pretty necessary as well. So when I kind of think about the toolkit that I see in a lot of organizations, it's usually something like that, like those sorts of pieces. I would say, as you get into larger organizations, you start thinking about how do I combine data from different parts of the organization, and then you get into more BI and like ETL type products that are more about getting data into a particular place so that you can start to analyze it. But yeah, I think that those are kind of the basics of the revenue tech stack. And I guess the last thing I'd say on the customer success side, I mean, there's products that are focused on that too, like Gainsight or Churn Zero or something along those lines, where there's a lot of opportunities there. But many of those pieces are taking on features of the other pieces, right? And so the lines get increasingly blurry in an effort to get rid of some of that duct tape and baling wire.
No, I like that though, because especially going back to one of your earlier points where you were talking about how it's not a funnel, it is a life cycle. I think that's a conversation, we continue to have it over and over, that the architecture, just like you would with a new piece of any technology or strategy you're putting into place, really thinking about all of those customer touch points, prospect touch points, where are they coming in and out, and how are you supporting them? I like that, because it really is an answer that it depends. Because right. The other one that we have on this list is how much does it all cost to get started? And, like you were saying on some of the questions, that's a whole other webinar around it, because it really is so unique, I think, to the situations that your business finds itself in. So, our final question that we wanted to close with, and thank you to everyone who's joined us today and to the speakers, because gosh, there's so much good information. Every time you all talk, we learn. What are the metrics? What's that low hanging fruit where if you're coming back, you've watched this presentation, you're armed with this, great information. What is the big ROI selling point if I'm introducing RevOps as a concept into my business? What should I lead with so that we can say, and this is going to make us awesome because?
Right. Well, I think when I think about the metrics that matter to businesses in general, right? And again, I'm taking a little bit of a tech and SaaS perspective here, but one of the things that I care a lot about is something that I say sales velocity. People have their different definitions about that, but when I think about sales velocity, I think about how much revenue are you generating per unit of time, right? And so one of the things you want to think about here is where are the places that I'm actually causing that to slow down, where we're either taking more time in part of the customer life cycle than we should be, or places where we are, lowering the value that we can be getting. And it could be as simple as, oh, you know what? We don't have a clearly defined way of managing our discounting process. Our discounting is completely all over the map, right? And so if we had, a RevOps organization that helped us standardize that and helped us execute that better, then most likely we would increase the, average our ASP by, 5%, and that would pay for itself, right? If you're a big enough organization. Or we have, our team is always waiting to close deals because legal is constantly backed up, and we don't have a customer, we don't have a contract lifecycle management piece. Like, okay, that's a place where we're slowed down. But a lot of the benefit of RevOps is in improving all of your core metrics over time, right? And then if you break down that sales velocity piece, the other piece that you need to be thinking about is how much does it cost you to do all of those things, right? And so that customer acquisition cost, at least on the new business side, that CAC is somewhere where I think RevOps can be super helpful as well, because if you're better allocating your resources by doing better segmentation, assigning, getting the right reps, working on the right deals at the right time, you can start to lower that CAC. You might take a temporary hit in CAC because you're hiring some more people who are focused on the revenue organization, but over time, you're going to find that you're able to increase your efficiency. So I think the cool part about RevOps is that it gives you this double hit of, most likely you're going to find places where if you operationalize things better, you're going to generate additional revenue or increase your average sales price. And you're also going to find that there are places where you're leaking deals or leaking opportunity, that where if you better operationalize things, you'd be able to lower your costs, and ultimately the combination of those two things increases sales velocity, increases your efficiency. So I think it's that's how I would look at it. It's much more of a holistic way of thinking about it. But if you are one of the lucky companies that everything is just perfectly swimming along operationally, and there's no lost opportunities, and there's no drags in your sales cycle, and your ASP is perfect, then you should be fine. Don't invest in RevOps. And I would like to invest in your company also, if that's
I was just saying, and please tell us who you are on
right.
And we're buying stock options very soon.
Right.
No, I like that. I mean, that's a really great way to look at it, because I think it's always a challenge, like, oh, I have to build another dashboard. We have to track another set of metrics. And so this really is going back to, like with the things around the teams and the tools, it's just combining all of them and breaking down those silos so we aren't having duplicative reports. Well, gang, thank you again for it. Hayes, Jen, where can they find out more about you, your company, the work that you've been doing? Sign up for your great newsletter up and to the right.
Gradient.works is where everything is. And we would love to talk to you. Our email addresses are just Hayes and Jenn at Gradient.works. But yeah, there's tons of stuff. We do have a newsletter. It's not salesy at all. It's not product focused. It's very much on these kinds of ideas and exploring, trends in RevOps. And we'd love, if you signed up, and we'd love to talk to you more. But thank you for listening. Thank you for having us.
Thanks
and to everyone who's been listening, we will be sharing that great copy of the glossary, so you can grab that one too. And I cut you off because there's a delay, Hayes. I'm so sorry. Please use your words and don't throw things at me through the screen.
No, thanks for having us.
So we'll see you this time next week. As always, we appreciate you sharing us, like us, add us, subscribe us, tell your friends, your neighbors, your mom. We think she's swell at niftymethod.com.